Hello, welcome to this half of a lecture in week 4 in your liberal arts module on pandemics and the effects of pandemics on societies. My name is Rob Gillis. I'm a professor of economics, specializing in particular in theoretical economics at the management school at Queen's University. I will talk about shocks on the economy and how, in particular in our contemporary economy, these shocks might affect economic wealth creation, as we can call that. I will do that from a very particular point of view, namely that the economy has a certain architecture. And our contemporary economy has the architecture of what we can call the platform economy. Platforms are the main devices for economic interaction in our contemporary economy. And as such, they introduce certain vulnerabilities, and these are very much affecting the situation today in 2020 in our global economy in relation to COVID-19. I will do that in 3 videos. This is the first video. This introduces the idea of architecture of an economy and how we can describe that architecture. The second video, I will talk about the particular architecture that emerged in our contemporary economy, and I do that from a historical perspective. So over time, how did the architecture of the economy evolve, and how did we end up in this platform economy as we have today? And in the third video, I will then talk about how shocks can affect the economy and how the architecture can absorb these shocks and how responses in the economy can be understood from the perspective of this architecture. And in particular, the rules that underpin this particular architecture. So I will do this as a voiceover with slides. I think that is the best way to do it. And I will introduce these ideas step by step, and hopefully I will be able to tell a good story with regard to understanding the consequences of the pandemic on our current contemporary global economy. I hope you enjoy these videos. As announced, in this first video, I will talk about how the economy is organized and how economic wealth is created in our global economy. And I in particular will talk about how we can understand the organization of the economy as a certain architecture of the economy. So, how is our global economy really organized? That is the first question I want to ask. And a closely related question then is, how do we actually produce and trade? Are we really living in a market economy? And my answer to this is not really. We are not really operating in a market economy. It's a misnomer to call the contemporary global economy a market economy. It is all about control and power in our global economy. And control and power is exercised through exclusive contracts. There is no competition, as we would expect in a market economy. So we are actually not operating in a market economy as we understand it from an economic theoretical perspective. If we then better understand how we actually produce and trade, how will then a shock like the pandemic affect the global economy? How will it affect our productivity? How will it affect our trade? So in order to understand this, we need a language that is different from market economics. Market economics is too limited in its offerings to understand the global economy. If I would impose that everything is seen through the vision of a market economist, then we would be struggling to understand the global economy, because in a market economy, we automatically assume that everything is competitive, for example, and that non-competition or non-competitive structures are anomalies. We talk about then market imperfections, so to say. That is not our current situation. This is not our contemporary global economy. So we need a better language. And that language is to apply the modern understanding of a lot of social interactions, and that is networks. So there's a large literature emerging on social networks, and those include also trade relationships. We have networks of trade relationships, and these networks we call supply chains. So we already have the language that we can use. So if we look at the global economy from the perspective of supply chains, we have already a much better understanding of how this global economy is functioning. The second element of the architecture, as I would like to call that, of a global economy is how we conduct ourselves. What is driving our decision making? And those are the rules that we use. What are the rules that we impose? And how are we conducting ourselves? So what is governing us in our trade relationships, in our interactions along these supply chains? So there is therefore emerging here a natural common language in which we can understand the global economy. And that is combining all these trade relationships with the institutional arrangements. And I call that the architecture. So there are two components to the architecture of an economy. And that is the trade network that describes how we are interacting with each other, and the institutional arrangement that we have, the rules that we apply in conducting these trades or interacting on the trade network. The second thing that is very useful of this language of architecture is that over time this architecture, of course, is changing, and we can therefore, by looking at, for example, the trade network that there is in the global economy, we can identify the changes, and these changes go hand in hand, of course, with changes in the institutional arrangements that we have. And so we can track how the economy evolves over time and how we go from one situation to the next, and how major disruptions affect the architecture and what is driving changes in this architecture in the economy. So let's look at some examples of what I'm talking about. So we can literally have a picture of an economy. So the language that I introduced allows us to look at, in particular, the network structure of the economy. And this network structure really reveals a lot already. So you can investigate the trade relationships and map them out, and we can identify then the various trade parties between which those trade relationships exist. And so we get a complete picture of the trade network. And we see here the trade network for apples at a very local, microscopic level here in South Belfast. So we look in particular at one retailer, a small grocery shop, a corner shop, and how apples are flowing from one producer to the next and then on to this retailer, and how this retailer interacts with its customers. So apples are produced by a farmer who owns an orchard. Then they're traded to a wholesaler. A wholesaler trades apples to the retailer, and the retailer trades them on to consumers. So we see here in the center a very clear, straightforward line. Producer, wholesaler, retailer, and then consumers. This is the core of the supply chain. But there are a lot of other parties involved with the supply chain. There's a lot of secondary flows in this supply chain. It is not only consumers who interact with the retailer. There are also food service providers, there are bakeries, there are charities that interact with the retailer and that are clients, customers of this retailer. And the wholesaler interacts also with other businesses. And we see here that we have a very, very complex structure, and that this structure reflects a much more complex flow than the straightforward one that we have in mind, namely producer of apples, wholesaler, retailer, consumers. That is a straightforward flow, but we see here a lot of secondary flows that make it extremely complex. And we see a lot of derivative products emerging. So if we compost the apples because they become old and inedible, that becomes a very different product. And there's a whole supply chain for compost related to this supply chain for apples. And that is revealed here in this trade network as well. What should be clear is that the global trade network, the global network of relationships in the economy, is extremely vast and very complex. And this is a tiny speck, a tiny snapshot of a very tiny little area of this vast, complex trade network. Here's a second example. PhD research was done in France to identify trade relationships in a real market. And so we have here the Marseille fish market. The Marseille fish market is that from the fishermen's boats, the fish is brought ashore and immediately put on the market in a market building, like we have here the St. George market, for example, in Belfast. But in a market building, the fish is displayed and sold immediately early in the morning to all kinds of customers. And I'm talking about a very specific class of customers here, namely the professional customers, the chefs of restaurants, the chefs of catering businesses, and other professional users of fish. And we see here a map of the trade relationships that emerge in this market. And we see that this market is not a free-for-all, like we would normally think of a market. It is very regulated and it is very specific. There are very specific trade relationships emerging, and we have customers that go back to the same seller again and again and again. And so we get clusters, and this looks very much like a social network that can be identified between, for example, people interacting on Facebook with each other. So it is not clear at all that we live in a market economy. Even when we look at a market, we see very specific networks emerge, trade networks. And markets are really very special configurations in these trade networks. And in many cases, these markets don't even exist. Even when we would look at this Marseille fish market, we would not necessarily identify it as a true market in which there is this all-encompassing competition. There are exclusive trade contracts enacted, and this market is therefore not a real market according to the theory of markets, but it is really a network. So my argument first of all is that our economy is a network, a very complex, multi-layered network, and that markets at best emerge as kind of nexuses in this trade network. And we can call this therefore a trade infrastructure as well. The second point is that our trade relationships that make up these wonderful networks are guided by something. We have an underlying system of rules, and we can call that a matrix, for example, or a governance system. So we use certain forms of contracts. For example, in the market that I just showed you, the Marseille fish market, all trade is conducted according to a very specific regime of rules. Prices are not advertised. There is no card in front of the fish that says it will be so and so much per kilo. That is not used. There is no pricing of the product at all on display. So there are no posted prices, as we call that. Instead, there is an individual conversation between a customer and a seller. And the seller will quote a price. And the customer is expected to just accept that price, and that's the end of the story. There is no negotiation, there is no bargaining. It is just an acceptance of a quoted price. When we think of shopping in a supermarket, we have a very different set of rules that guide our behavior. Namely, everywhere the prices are posted, and we expect that these posted prices are binding. So when we select a product from the shelves, we expect that the supermarket will honor the price that is quoted there. Similarly, we are not expected to be bargaining at the cash register. We also take these prices as given, and by posting these prices, we have essentially a proposal for a contract, and we take that as binding. The proposal is binding. Now, this is a very specific set of rules, and we all learn those rules, and we all act accordingly. And so our behavior is governed with those rules in mind. Okay, so we have trade networks and rules. And underlying all of this is the creation of this economic wealth. Namely, the trade network is based on a social division of labor. Somebody is a farmer and owns the orchard where the apples are grown. Somebody sets up a wholesale company that trades those apples. And somebody becomes a shop owner and starts a retail business, a grocery. And in that grocery, the apples will be sold. So we have underlying all of this a social division of labor. I will not dwell on this too much, and I will instead just refer to the results from the social division of labor, namely that architecture. Another name for the architecture might be a global production network, and that refers then to these global supply chains that make up that global production network. In that global production network, and also enforced by those rules that we use, we have the exercise of power. In our relationship with the supermarket has a certain power. When we enter the supermarket, we submit ourselves to all the prices that are quoted by the supermarket. And the only thing we can do is just say no and walk away. We are not able to influence the proposed prices at all. The only way that we can protest to the prices that are imposed on us is to say no and to walk away. But then we also forego any trade that we might have in mind when we enter the shop. Power is very much part of the architecture and is expressed not only in the network structure but also in the rules that we use. So both elements reflect the power. So also in the architecture, when we talk about power, this power is usually expressed by middleman positions. For example, the wholesaler is a middleman between the farmer and the retailer. And if that wholesaler wants to influence the trades that happen with regard to those apples, then it can do that very easily. The wholesaler has a position of power, and it can make handsome profits from manipulating prices and setting certain conditions of trade on those relationships. This concludes the introduction of this particular subject, I have discussed what I understand an architecture to be, namely a network, and the second component, the rules, and those are very closely related. We have seen that certain rules to lead to certain networks and the other way around. So they're very closely related elements that make up this architecture. In the next video, I will talk about how these architectures evolved over time and how we moved from a feudal economy to our contemporary platform economy, as we can call that.